Hello poets, Jim Critchlow here. This is a YouTube video that I'm hoping to introduce you to Robert Alter and specifically the art of biblical poetry. Now, those of you who had me in prophecy know that I have a love-hate relationship with this Jewish secular critic who teaches at Berkeley. I love to interact with him as a dialogue partner. Every time I read Alter, I find that I need to have my phone handy where I can look up on every page I'm going to find at least one word that I don't understand. Even though I've read this book 5 times, I commend to you a very careful and deliberate, slow reading of Alter. It takes a little bit of time to kind of catch his style. Now, he wrote The Art of Biblical Narrative, and it was primarily about the passages in the Pentateuch and how they develop along a narrative axis. What he does in this book is he goes on a rant about how poetry is so different. It's worth considering what he has to say. As a matter of fact, it's material that I find very influential in my own thinking. Now, when I was doing my own dissertation, I had to do a major shift. In my study of the last living king of Judah, a guy named Jehoiakim, I did 3 full chapters of exhaustive exegesis, where I looked at every word, every phoneme, every verse, looking at the implications of the text. When I got to the poetry, and there was about 7 chapters of poetry, I had to completely revise my approach because it's so much more complicated. What we're going to do in this book is try and explain how that complication informs the reader. On page number 3, Alter introduces this Russian novelist named Nabokov. You may have heard of him. I'm going to quote 3 of his poems that are used in the book Lolita. The first one: "Do not be angry with the rain, it simply does not know how to fall upwards." That surprising poetic reversal gets at the heart of poetry. Here's the second one. "And presently I was driving through the drizzle of the dying day, with the windshield wipers in full action, but unable to cope with my tears." Again, a very poetic, expressive, emotional verse. And the last one. "Human life is but a series of footnotes to a vast, obscure, unfinished masterpiece." Now, each one of these Nabokov quotes gets at the idea of why Alter feels we need to have an explanation of poetry. He begins his treatment on page 5 with the quotation of his translation. He also supplies the transliteration, which you will not need since all of you have had the Hebrew, and we're going to look at this, of course, in the Hebrew. He supplies his translation of Genesis 4 and then comments on how Lamech is amping up the curse on Cain. Cain would be revenged 7 times, and Lamech claims 77 times. In every one of his examples in chapter 1, he gives a poetic verse, and then he explains it for 3 or 4 or 5 pages going on after that. I particularly liked at the end of the chapter on page 26, where he talks about the Proverbs 2, Nokriah. We're going to find that expression of the adulteress later on in his book. I commend that to you. In the next chapter, particularly on pages 30 and 31, he does an extensive exposition of 2 Samuel 22. Be sure to understand his marks in between the verses of synonyms, complementarity, focusing, and consequentiality. Pages about 28, 29, and then 30 and 31 are the actual display, 32, and then he talks about that in great detail. I find that pretty straightforward, although if you have troubles with it, we can talk about it in class. On page 55 on page 43 and 47, there is a wonderful exposition on the difference between the poem regarding Yael's destruction of Sisera, which is spoken by Deborah, and on page 47, the narrative of the exact same event in Judges 4. you see both a poem and a narrative arrayed pretty much side by side, and it helps to explain why the poem is used. On pages 55 to 56, we see Proverbs 7, the full exposition of the Nokriah, the alien or forbidden woman who lures the foolish young man to his doom. On pages 76 and 77, there's a pretty good treatment of Job 3. Job is a special category of literature. We'll get to that later. In Job 1 and 2, Satan comes to God and says, if you take the hedge off of Job, then he will curse you to his face. He'll curse God. And God says, no, he won't. And so the wager is on. Job doesn't know about what has happened in heaven, but he suffers all that the accuser can heap on him. Job chapter 3, where Satan has challenged God, if you remove the hedge, Job will curse you. Job never does curse. So God absolutely knows Job's qualities, and he uses Job as the example of an upright man. But in Job 3, Job curses the day of his birth. It's a very interesting retrospective cursing going back all the way to the day that Job was born. As a matter of fact, even 9 months earlier than that, to the day he was conceived. And God is invoked to curse not only the day, but the announcement and the conception of a man-child. I know that it's difficult to read Alter, but it will pay a dividend. After you finish these first 3 chapters, which are introductory in nature, then we'll go on to chapter 4 on Job, chapter 5 on the Psalms, chapter 6 on prophetic poetry, 7 on Proverbs, 8 the Song of Songs, and 9 the life of the tradition. I will see you on Thursday.